saying ACS is totally different.
Yeah.
But they also say that if that it's a budget, right? Like there is some data they can't And so I keep saying, you keep telling me that, and I know you haven't completely figured out these splits yet. But what if then we decide we can't do this? Because that child-parent relationship thing, that's where we get our poverty. If we can get our poverty, and I found myself explaining to Dana. Yeah, she didn't understand that. I had to explain to her. We don't measure poverty in untitled
Right.
And you have to understand that the child, we actually have no poverty gap for kids who don't leave households. So it's a smaller, there's a universe of kids we don't even measure.
Right.
So
Yeah, it's scary. I think it was illuminating for us to take our group of demographers and statisticians and actually go meet with the population branch and statistics people, because it was clear they had no clue what the impacts are. Like they hadn't met with the internal American Indian geography people. They didn't know there were funding formulas in place, or they actually didn't either way.
So they definitely haven't talked to people to figure out what funding formulas are.
We were the ones that brought them together. Like after our meeting, the White House had to tell the federal agencies to go to this webinar we had, where they would say that for each federal agency said, well, we use census data for this formula, that formula, and this network. So now allegedly they're meeting, but I don't know that many agencies are motivated to meet with them and get this figured out.
Priority, but I do think the census people are well intentioned.
Yeah.
I don't know whether they understand this stuff.
They don't, and that's the scary part. It's the scary part because they're making decisions, and the decisions are going to be made at a higher level by people who maybe don't really understand it also. So, but they seem genuinely interested. He was not in the meetings, he was invited, but he was not in the meetings. But he's probably going to be at the table when the decisions are made.
Does it make sense to try and do something?
The room change. Okay.
Was it a lot of?
It's okay. I think we'll get started. Good morning to everybody. I think probably some more people will be joining us as they figure out the room change. But as I said before, we do want to be mindful that this is also being live streamed, so we want to begin relatively on time. Of course, there are a few housekeeping tips I need to share. So as you hopefully know, the exhibit emporium hours are open until 4 today, and then tomorrow from 7:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. And be sure to get your passports stamped and turn them into the registration boxes by 5 o'clock tonight, so you're eligible for raffle prizes. You will get a conference evaluation by email after the conference. Please fill that out because it helps us as we plan for next year's conference. Keep your name tag on at all times. You would have to purchase a new one if you don't have it, and for this evening's night out, you will need to have your badge on you. And again, if you would turn off your cell phones and pagers, both for the speakers but also for those at home that might be watching. And directly after the presentations, you can go on your app to this session, and there's a little survey there. If you would fill that out, that's very helpful to us. It's helpful to the presenters. So let me begin. I want to introduce our three speakers to my left and your right. First, and I'm going to read all of these again for folks who may not be in the room and don't have the programs with them. So Deborah Stein, who became the first leader of the Partnership for America's Children in 2015, has more than 30 years of experience in policy analysis and advocacy on behalf of vulnerable children and their families. She's a nationally recognized child advocate and strategic communications expert who is passionate about improving children's lives through better public policy. Before she came to the partnership, she spent 8 years at the Hatcher Group, a public affairs and communications firm where she served as vice president of public policy. Debbie also spent 9 years with Voices for America's Children, the predecessor organization to the partnership, where she rose to become director of policy and advocacy and a member of the senior management team. Debbie previously worked for the Food Research and Action Center and as a consultant for several national legal services organizations. She spent 6 years at Brooklyn Legal Services, where she represented indigent clients in housing matters and in obtaining public assistance. She was co-president of the New York City Legal Services Union Local. A cum laude graduate of Princeton University, Debbie has a law degree from New York University. She's written or co-authored reports for Kids Count, the Coalition on Human Needs, and the Save for All campaign, Tax Credits for Working Families, First Focus, Voices for America's Children, and the Clearinghouse Review. Our second presenter to her left is Lizette Escobedo. She currently serves as the director of the National Census Program at the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials Educational Fund, where she leads national efforts to ensure a full count of Latino hard-to-count populations. Prior to returning to the NALEO Educational Fund, she worked as communications director at SEIU Local 2015, one of the largest long-term care local unions in the country, representing over 386,000 long-term care workers in California. Lizette has dedicated over 12 years of her career to mobilizing and empowering communities to ensure they have a voice in the democratic process and to ensure they play an integral role in the policy and legislative decisions that impact their communities and quality of life. In 2016, Lizette was elected to serve as delegate representing the 57th Assembly District, and in 2019, she was named Woman of the Year by Majority Leader Ian Calderon. Lizette has led social justice campaigns at the local, state, and federal levels for the past decade. She's managed teams of staff, secured funding for a multitude of nonprofit organizations, including $1.4 million for the Mia Familia Vota Education Fund, has led innovative digital and technology programs in the labor movement, and created significant local, state, and strategic national relationships for the advancement of communities of color. Lisette also served as a key stakeholder in the Alliance for Citizenship, a coalition created to advance immigration reform efforts and deferred action for childhood arrivals. She ran for office in her hometown of Whittier, California, following a voting rights lawsuit taking her city from at-large elections to council districts, noting a potential opening to elect the first Latina to city council. While falling 4 votes short, Lisette continues to work with local networks to ensure young women of color step into leadership positions locally and nationally. In January of 2019, Lisette returned to the NALEO Educational Fund to lead census efforts for the second time after overseeing national efforts in 2010. Lisette double majored in Communications and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego. And our third and final presenter, to her left, is Dr. Yvette Rubidoux. She is Rosebud Sioux and Standing Rock Sioux. Yvette is the Vice President for Research and Director of the Policy Research Center at the National Congress of American Indians. The Ncaa Policy Research Center provides tribal leaders with the best available knowledge to make strategically proactive policy decisions in a framework of Native wisdom that positively impacts the future of Native peoples. Her prior work includes research, education, health systems administration, and policy development in the areas of American Indian, Alaska Native health, and the quality of diabetes care. She served in the Obama administration as a senior advisor to the HHS Secretary for American Indians and Alaska Natives, and as the director of the Indian Health Service. She's an adjunct professor in the Department of Health Systems, Management, and Policy in the Colorado School of Public Health at the University of Colorado, and her previous academic appointments include clinical professor and associate dean for diversity, inclusion, and leadership at the Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine at Washington State University, and an assistant professor at the University of Arizona College of Medicine and Zuckerman College of Public Health. Dr. Rubidoux served as the co-director of the Coordinating Center for the IHS Special Diabetes Program for Indians, Diabetes, and Cardiovascular Disease Prevention Demonstration Projects, directed training programs to encourage American Indian and Alaska Native students to enter health and research professions, is a founder of the Native Research Network, Inc., and served as president of the Association of American Indian Physicians. Dr. Rubidoux received her undergraduate medical and public health degrees at Harvard, is the author of several peer-reviewed research publications, and co-edited the 2001 book, Promises to Keep: Public Health Policy for American Indians and Alaska Natives. Please join me in welcoming our panel. Debbie.
Thank you so much for inviting us here and for caring about the census. This is something that all three of us are dedicating a lot of time to because it really matters for young kids. And so we're going to try and explain that to you and then talk about the role that you guys can play. Let me start by explaining that I run the Partnership for America's Children. We're a network of 53 child advocacy organizations in 41 states that advocate for better policies for kids at the state and local level. And we are serving as the national hub on the undercount of young children in the 2020 census. And as part of that, we are running the Count All Kids campaign, and that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. I think that'll do it. Whoop, I'm in there. So, if you leave today knowing only a few things, these are the things we want you to know, and then I'm going to go deeper. The first is that the number of young children that are missed in the decennial census, that's the census we take every 10 years, is large. It's been growing for 40 years. This is not a new problem, and it makes a big difference to children. Children thrive more when we count them. You also need to know that we miss young children even when we count adults. And that means we need different strategies for counting young children. You could count every adult in a community and still miss a lot of kids. It is also true that home visiting program staff have a variety of ways in which you can help make sure that we count young children. And one of the most important reasons for that is that families trust home visitors. And so they're going to listen to you if you talk to them about why they need to fill out the census and make sure they include their young children. So let's start by talking about why it helps young children thrive to be counted in the census. And there's a number of reasons. The one that you most often probably hear about is that it makes a difference for political representation. So when the decennial census is used to allocate House representatives among states, it is used to redraw legislative lines, redistricting, not only for the House of Representatives at the national level, but also for state legislatures, for county councils, for school districts. So it really matters. Communities that miss a lot of young children have less political power to fight for what the kids need. It also makes a difference for money, and I'm going to break that out in two different ways because there's two different kinds of federal funding. There's a kind where the money is allocated by formula, and there's a kind where we start with a total amount set by Congress. For the programs that are allocated by a formula that are in the design of the program, which are often called mandatorily funded programs or entitlements, if we miss kids, that's less money that goes into the programs overall. And the 5 programs where we can really try and count the impact are Medicaid, children's health insurance, foster care, adoption assistance, and one part, the mandatory part of the child care funding. As you can see, those really matter for kids. We missed so many young children in the 2010 census that states are missing out on over $500 million a year in federal funding for kids for the decade between when that data was released and when the next one is. That's a lot of money that could be going to serve children and, in the case of Medicaid, their families. We also have programs, and that includes home visiting, where the total amount is set by Congress, but then the distribution to states and sometimes to communities is set using decennial census data. And so in those cases, while the total amount of money doesn't change, making sure the money goes to the communities that need it most, that is based on the decennial census. When we don't count kids in a community, they don't get their fair share of the total amount that Congress has allocated. In addition to home visiting, that includes Title I funds for low-income schools. It includes special education programs. It includes the other part of the child care funding. It includes Head Start expansion funds. It doesn't include Head Start basic funds. It includes WIC. So there are a lot of programs that matter for kids where if we don't count a lot of young children in a particular community, it won't get its fair share of the programs we need for children to thrive. I don't know why it is showing that. Sorry. There are reasons that have nothing to do with money also about, about why children need to be counted. One is planning. So local governments in particular use decennial census data to do a lot of planning. That's because this is the one count that the Census Bureau does that is not a survey with sampling. We count everybody, so the data is much better at local levels. And so, for example, school demographers use decennial census data to figure out how many kids will be coming into their schools, how many classrooms they need, how many chairs they need. It also matters for health facilities, it matters for business, and that can make a big difference to kids. A lot of you may be working in communities that are food deserts, that have no grocery stores, and where families either have to drive a long distance to buy food, or they're buying at little bodegas that don't carry a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables that kids need. Grocery store chains decide what communities to move into based on data about how many people live there. If we miss a lot of people in those communities, the grocery store chains will think they don't have a market and will not build in there. So even when we're talking about business, it does make a big difference on how well children will thrive to make sure that we count everybody. It also just affects our policy data. When policymakers are trying to decide how many children are being raised by grandparents and whether they need programs to support those families and how many people will benefit from them, decennial census data is very useful for those kinds of policy decisions. The other thing to understand is that the impact of this lasts for a decade. And that's because, as I said, this is the only thing the census does where they count everybody. It's not a survey. It's not a sample. Everything else that the Census Bureau does to produce data about our families in our country is based on surveys where they sample from different communities and they decide how many people to sample from different communities based on the decennial census and the estimates of population they grow from that. So if we miss people in a community, our data about that community is skewed for the next decade. So it really makes a big difference in a whole variety of ways. I said before that it's large and growing. Well, how big and how much is it growing? So in 2010, we missed 1 in 10 young children, over 2 million young children. I'm giving you two numbers here. One is the number of kids that we missed. That's the 10% number. The other is what we call the net undercount, which is what the final count ended up being after we took into account both the kids that are missed and the kids that are double counted. That was just under 1 million. A lot of kids get double counted if, for example, the families have joint custody and both parents count them. We're pretty sure that the kids that get double counted are in different communities than the kids that get missed. So Dr. O'Hare, who is the national expert on counting the undercount of young children, and I both are pretty convinced that the most important number is that omissions number, but I'm giving you both because we only have the omissions number nationally, and everything else I've got to tell you about in terms of data is net undercount, which means you can look at all the numbers I'm going to give you and think that minimizes the impact, but that's all the Census Bureau has. We're actually trying to get them to do a more local data with omissions for 2020. Young children had the highest undercount by far of any age group. And you'll notice the age group with the next worst undercount was the 5 to 9-year-olds. We do a very bad job of counting young children. We actually have been getting better and better at counting adults, and most adult groups we double count, we overcount. But we miss a lot of young children. There are other groups where we miss people at a higher rate, and that is typically Hispanic young men and Black young men, but those are smaller total populations, so the biggest group we miss of any group is young children. That's the single largest number of people that we miss. You will not be surprised to hear that we miss Hispanic young children at a much higher rate than white young children, and that we miss Black young children almost as much. But I also want to point out to you that even if we just look at white young children, we're missing white young children at a higher rate than any other group when you count all the races. We don't have data on Asian Americans or Native Americans, but it's likely that we also miss them at higher rates than the general population. It's also true that we miss them more in big counties. The bigger the county, the more likely we are to miss a higher rate, a larger percentage of our young children. And that's useful if you're thinking about where you want to focus your attentions. And I said it's been growing. So up until 1980, we counted adults and young children at about the same effectiveness rate. But starting after that, we got better and better at counting adults, and at the same time, we got worse and worse at counting young children. And I cannot tell you why, because the Census Bureau has not done the research to tell us why. But that's obviously a grave concern, because if we don't flip that trend, our undercount's going to be even worse in 2020. So what do we know about why we miss young children in the census? I'm going to start by telling you that we don't know as much as we need to know. So what I'm sharing with you is what we know right now, but we definitely need more research on this. That's interesting. Oh, I see why it's doing that again. Sorry. Okay. So let's talk first about which children are most at risk of being missed. Children who are most at risk of being missed include all of these groups. One is children who were not a child of the householder. The householder is the person who fills out the form. And after they fill out the form about themselves, they list everyone else in the household and they say what the relationship of that person is to the householder, the person filling out the form. So children who are the grandchild of the householder are at higher risk of being missed than kids who are the child of the householder. Children who are not related to the householder at all are at higher risk, or are more distantly related are at higher risk. In general, children that live in complex households are at risk. Complex households are pretty much anything except one or two parents and the children. The moment you add additional people with different relationships, the kids are at risk of being missed. Hispanic and racial minorities, yes, you already know, they're at higher risk of being missed. Linguistically isolated households, the kids in them are at risk of being missed. That doesn't mean bilingual households. It's the household where the adults who fill out the form are not fluent in English and struggle with the form. Children who live in rent or occupied housing and multi-unit structures, some of that is probably just that when the census taker comes to talk to people, they physically can't get in the building. But some of it also is that households that move a lot, children are at risk of being missed, as are the adults. Very young children are missed at particularly high rates. Children living in the largest or the smallest households. So on the large side, I'll talk a little bit later about why people are afraid to show how many people are living in the household. On the small side, a lot of those may be like teen moms with babies. And children in households that didn't fill out the form themselves and the census taker had to come talk to them, they're at higher risk of being missed. Probably in some cases they don't tell the census taker who's in the household, but in some cases the enumerator never talks to them and talks to talks to neighbors or the landlord and doesn't get the information. So, one of the things that we know that really makes a big difference is that many young children are left off the form when families fill it out. And our own public opinion research that we did with Count All Kids, trying to figure out who would get counted in 2020, shows us that 10% of parents, we did a survey online with 800 families making less than $50,000 a year who have children under 5 in their household. 10% of those parents would not put the child on. Another 8% were uncertain whether they should put them on. So even in households where it is the parent filling out the form, kids are at a pretty high risk of being missed. Another factor is fear and confusion. We know that there's general distrust of government and that has grown significantly since the last census. The Census Bureau's own research shows us to that. We also have nearly 2 million young children who are living with at least one undocumented parent. I think everybody in this room understands that right now all immigrant families are scared, and of course families with at least one undocumented member are particularly scared and particularly unlikely to feel comfortable filling out the form. And young children are almost entirely citizens because they were born here. But if the whole household doesn't fill out the form, the young child is likely to get missed. But we also know that children are missed because they live in overcrowded housing units, and our focus groups tell us that people are very afraid that their landlord is going to learn who's there and that the landlord's going to evict them because the household is crowded. Now, there's very strong census confidentiality protections, and I'll talk about that, but the fear is that if they count everybody, they're going to get evicted, and so they tend to leave off people fill out the form typically oldest to youngest, and they tend to leave off the young children. There's also some settings where it's grandparents taking care of grandchildren and they're living in senior citizen housing and the young child isn't supposed to be there, but generally fear that their landlord will learn and that's going to create problems for them. That is a factor in why children get left off. So, how do we find the communities where kids are most at risk of being missed? Dr. O'Hare and the Population Reference Bureau Research Bureau did a study of the 2010 data and identified 4 factors that show communities that are particularly at high risk of missing kids. And this is important because they may or may not be the same communities where adults are at risk of being missed. And so when people are planning their census outreach, they're currently using maps that just focus on where adults are at risk of being missed, and they could miss communities where kids could be missed. The 4 factors are a very high percentage of racial and ethnic minorities, a very high percentage of linguistically isolated households, a very high percentage of young children living with grandparent householders, and a very high percentage of young children living with non-relative householders or in group quarters. Group quarters might be kids who are living in prison with their parents, or it might be kids who are living in shelters, or it might be kids who are seriously disabled and living in nursing homes. It's a relatively small group. But a lot of young children live with non-relative householders because they're effectively homeless and they're living in doubled-up housing. Those kids are at very high risk of being missed. So what are we trying to do to help count all kids? We've developed a strategy based on the information that I've shared with you so far. The first step in that strategy is, now that we've identified what factors put a community at high risk of missing kids, the PRB and Dr. O'Hare are doing an analysis of all the big census tracts in the country and figuring out which ones are at high risk of missing kids. And then they're going to put that into something called the Hard to Count Map 2020, which is a project of the City University of New York. Right now it only has information about where adults are at risk. We will be adding information about kids. So if you're living in a particular community, you can go on that map and figure out what parts of your community are at high risk of missing kids. And I think that data should be up in a month or two. We've conducted a lot of message research, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, and we've been really lucky. We've identified messages that persuade parents it's important to count their kids. Based on that, we are about to develop outreach tools to persuade families to count their children, and then we're disseminating them through a national campaign. So I'll say right here, if you want to get our materials so that you can use them or think about using them, go to countallkids.org and sign up to get the campaign materials. It's countallkids.org. And then there's two different signups. Use the one for campaign. You'll get all the campaign materials as we release them, as well as other information and tools for helping to count young children. So we are doing some work at the national level with the Census Bureau, but at the state and local level, we're doing three things. One is we're helping state and local advocates work to form something called complete count committees, and I can talk more about them later if people are interested, but basically those are either government groups or private groups that might be organizations and philanthropy. Whatever they are trying to support the count in their community of everybody. They're not doing it. The Census Bureau does it. The complete count committees are getting the word out that it matters to their community to count everybody. They're answering questions. They're setting up places where people can fill out the form online. They're trying to create media events. They're doing things that will make it easier to count everyone in their community. And so we're trying to help advocates get those formed, get them funded, although we're getting pretty late in the year to get funding for them, and to make sure that counting young children is a priority. Once they're formed, we're trying to help advocates work with those committees to build effective plans for counting young children by telling them to use that hard-to-count map I talked about and persuading them to use either our messages or even our message materials. It's disturbing how many people come to me who've been working with complete count committees and say, our complete count committee says counting young children is a priority, and then they do nothing about it. They don't have a specific strategy for kids. And so it's really important, if there is a complete count committee in your community, you don't necessarily need to go sit on it, and you may not be able to, but it's really important to go to them and say, what's your strategy here for counting kids? Here are some tools that will help you do a better job of it. And the other thing we're doing that has nothing to do with complete count committees is we are working with different groups of providers, national networks of like parents as teachers, obviously, but also child care groups and pediatricians and any national network of organizations that work with families with young children to try and get them to use our outreach materials and go directly to the families. So I want to talk a little bit about what we learned about persuading people to count their young children. We did a pretty intensive message research campaign. We did 13 focus groups with families with young children. A lot of those were with complex households to try and figure out who they actually thought of as part of their family and were likely to count and what would persuade them to count others. We did 3 with immigrant households, which were very revealing. We had some others. We did 2 with providers, and we did that because we know that the best way to reach these families is by persuading child care workers and WIC providers and librarians and home visiting staff, all of these different groups to work with families. We needed to know what providers need to know to feel comfortable doing this outreach. And so we did 2 focus groups with them. We did the online survey I mentioned, and we also did a California oversample. We may do some more this fall. We're in the middle of trying to decide that. Once we develop our materials, we will do at least 4 and maybe 6 focus groups using those materials to make sure that they correctly interpret our message research and they work. And then we're going to put up on our website posters, flyers, fact sheets, social media tools that anyone can pull down and use. I'm trying to get printing money, and if I can, then you'll be able to order printed copies. I have a little money for that. I don't know how much I'll get. But if you can't get printed copies, you can always pull them down from our website. And we're going to try and put them in different size formats. So, if you can afford to print a 2x3 poster and you want to, it'll be there in those proportions. If you just want to print out an 11, a 8.5 by 11 page version to put up in a site, you'll have that. We're trying to set it up to make it really easy to work with. What did we find? Well, the most important thing we found is that there is some uncertainty about whether they will count young children for any kind of family structure. Generally speaking, they think they should count anybody who lives there full-time, regardless of relationships. So if it's a grandparent with a parent and the parent's boyfriend is living in the house, they'll assume they should count the boyfriend too. But even so, 80% of parents would not count, will count their own child under 5. 10% won't, 8% are not sure. 80% is a great result in most polls. And I keep having to remind my pollster that it's not a good result in the census, that we cannot afford to miss 1 out of 5 kids. The ratio of whether they're likely to count young children gets worse if the kids are splitting their time between households, or if the child is not their own child. So even if a grandparent is caring for a child full-time, if the parent is the legal guardian, some of them don't think they're supposed to count the child or don't want to look like they are getting in the way of the parental relationship. They're less likely to count that child. And the kids that really they almost all kind of assume they should not count is the kids who are there temporarily. Even if they've been there for 6 months or a year, according to our focus groups, and even if they have no other place to live. So trying to count those kids who are in households, because they're couch surfing, because they're doubling up, that's really tough, and it particularly is going to need some hard work. So we said to them, why won't people count young children? Now, this is asking both people who say they will and people who say they won't, but it was, I don't think this is a rigorous study, but it was informative. I don't know why that keeps popping up. 50% say they don't know whether they're supposed to. Almost as many say they don't understand why the government cares about young children. A number of them say it's because another adult who lives somewhere else has custody, or the children are there temporarily, that they split their time. These are all things that had kind of surfaced in our focus groups and shown up in the research. The bottom line is people don't assume they're supposed to count their young children. We also, something that showed up in our focus groups was, well, if I don't deduct them on my taxes, I'm not supposed to count them. Well, it has nothing to do with your taxes, but that was what a lot of people thought. So what worked? What persuaded people that they should count their young children? These are the 3 messages that were, there's 5 messages. These are the first 3 that were really helpful, and they're all consistent with each other. One is knowing you can fill out the census on your own schedule and that it only takes about 10 minutes to complete makes parents much more likely to fill out the census and to include everyone living in the household. That made 3/4 of people more likely to count the child and over half much more likely. So that's really important. Talking about the privacy guarantees, it's not enough to just say we have very strong privacy guarantees. You have to tell them what they are. And I saw that particularly in our immigrant focus groups. We would tell them what the privacy protections are, and people's bodies would just relax. It was really quite amazing. What they are is if a census employee reveals individual information, they face up to 5 years in prison or up to a $250,000 fine. And it's the rigor of that that convince people that they are safe counting their young children. The other message that was really effective is counting your young children in the census means your local schools will get more funding for your children, which is logical. Then we tested two kind of more formally written messages, and these both worked really well. One is the census happens only once every 10 years. So if we don't count a 2-year-old, your community will have less funding for education, childcare, and other services children need for a decade. That got even more effective if we added the words, that's most of their childhood. That really resonated to people. And then, there we go. We also tested the message, census data will help local government plan for the future and determine where $800 billion a year in federal funding goes. We now know that's actually over $1 trillion, but for practical purposes, it's all just really big numbers, right? People just know it's a lot of money. Including medical services, WIC, childcare, public schools, public transit, and low-income housing. People thought of public transit and low-income housing as kids' programs because they really do make a difference to kids' lives. So what can home visiting programs do to prepare for the census right now in 2019? The first is find out if your community has a complete count committee. If it doesn't, try and talk to, now most states have one. I think we have 6 states that don't, something like that. But a lot of communities still don't have one. So find out if your community has one. There is a map on the census website where they're trying to track them. Your local public officials should know if there is one. And if there isn't one, try and get one formed, either by your local public officials, or maybe you can get a foundation to just host a meeting and invite a lot of people in organizations that can help with the count. And try and make young children a priority as part of that group. And then work with your complete count committees, whether they already exist or not, to help them draft plans that target families with young children using our campaign materials. Yes, there's a question over there.
How do they handle pregnancy?
How do they handle pregnancy? You count someone only after they're born. So any baby that is born before or on April 1st, you count, but you don't count a pregnancy.
So then all those children that are born right after then live those 10 years in communities without basically being counted, or they do something to match up with that data?
So they do estimates every year based on the decennial data where they project out. So the babies get picked up at that point if they were not born by April 1st. But any baby that is, even if they're still in the hospital, they should get counted. And then the third thing you can do is the Census Bureau has a statistics in school program. And that statistics in school program produces a lot of materials that schools can use to educate children, and there's take-home materials for families about why the census matters and why they should get counted in 2020. And it includes some pretty nice preschool materials that you can just pull down off their website with a cute song and some coloring pages, and kids can take those home and show them to their parents. I've spent a lot of time trying to make sure people know about the statistics in school programs because I think they help us with 3 groups. They help us with kids who have younger siblings at home. That's sort of obvious. To the extent that teen moms are in school, they're a good way of reaching that population, which is a very hard to count group. But the third is it helps us get into those linguistically isolated families. Because in a family where the adults don't speak English, very often the child speaks it better and serves as the family translator. And so if you educate kids in school about this, you're more likely to get that whole family counted, including any younger siblings who live at home. The Statistics in School program is doing a mailing, I think it's already gone out to superintendents with all their materials. And in the end of this month or sometime next month, they're doing a mailing to every principal in the country, public school, parochial, or private, that includes these materials and a big wall map. So all that people need to do is to go into your principals and your superintendents and say, you got this mailing or you're going to get this mailing. This mailing is like money in the bank for our school system. Please use these materials. It will help us get more kids counted and we'll get more federal dollars for the next decade. It's a pretty easy lift, right? If you're going to do one thing you can go back and talk to your school officials, the superintendents and the principals, and ask them to use those materials and make the connection to them for school money, because it's really in their self-interest to use those materials. There will also be a Statistics in School Week in March, the first week in March, and so you might also want to talk to them about participating in that. And if you're working with kids in homes or with preschools, you can also get them to use the preschool materials. So then, oh, yes, we have a question over here.
What is this, how does the Statistics in Schools entity treat schools associated with the Bureau of Indian Education?
You know, I was just asked how they treat the schools associated with Bureau of Indian Education. I assume that they send them materials, but I will confirm that. I talk with them every other week, and I will make sure that they're doing that. I was told it's every school.
I hope so.
Right, but I'll make sure. But, I mean, they certainly are getting homeschooling. It would be surprising to me if they're not getting tribal schools, but it's absolutely worth checking. We have another question back here.
So the census forms go by address, correct?
They do go by address. Every form that gets mailed to a household has an address form on it, and that is to count everybody in the household. They only get one. So if you have 15 people living in a household, they all should go on that form.
Right, but what happens with multi-use, like a two-flat? Are they getting,
If they have two addresses, they get two mailings.
so a first floor and a second floor would get separate mail?
If they have a separate address, that's right.
And if they don't, if it's an illegal apartment kind of thing? Because I know in our community, we see whoever's on the address does it and then doesn't count the
Right.
other family living in the building.
So they should count everybody in the building. Obviously, having an illegal apartment would be a reason why people would not want to. There is something that people can do to get counted if they were not given the form and didn't get put on it. Even though every form has an address, you can also go online without that unique identifier and fill out the form online, putting in the address you live at, and filling it out as much as you can for everybody. Now, I know that sounds a little weird. Why don't you just put in the people you think were missed? The reason you put in everybody is so that the Bureau knows you really do live there because you know the other people, and then they will back out the double counts. So if you have people living in illegal apartments who think they didn't get counted, they should go online, they should fill it out, and they should put in as much information as they know about everybody living at that address. That is really important also for those doubled up families. If they don't think they got counted, they can go make sure they got counted by just filling it out separately online. So I want to get through this a little more, and then I have two colleagues, obviously, who also want to talk. What can you do in 2020? First of all, you can use our materials, and we are going to be pushing out materials really more like 3 waves. January and February, the materials will be educating people about why the census matters. March and April, we'll be activating them. The census is now, it's time to count everybody. You know, if you're not sure whether someone's lived and slept with you most of the time, count them if they were there April 1st. And then starting in late April through July, we will talk about it's not too late. If you don't think you got counted, you can still get counted. You can also host community events explaining how the census brings money to your community and school district and answering questions. There will be toolkits available for doing that. We will have some, but also censuscounts.org is a website which is pulling together resources from all the different census advocacy groups. So that's another website that's a really good resource. You can try to address language differences in your community, for example, by having parents who are bilingual translating for those who are not, and providing translation services. I want to talk a little bit about getting low literacy families to respond. But let me back up a moment and talk about the census. The census is different in a lot of ways, and some of those are very problematic. But there's something about this census that could be very good if it works well, and that is that for the first time, families can reply online. They've had some families be able to do that in the past, but this is the first time everyone can. And in fact, 80% of households, that's how they will be asked to respond initially, and they will only get a paper form if they don't do that. And everyone can also pick up the phone and call and give their answers on the phone for the first time. Not only that, there are going to be 13 different phone lines, English and 12 different languages. So if you speak one of those 12 languages, you don't even have to work your way through the, do you speak English part. You call, and from that moment, you're talking to someone who knows Portuguese or Russian or whatever those 12 languages are. I believe that that's particularly important for low literacy families. Filling out government forms is really daunting if your literacy level is low. You may be able to read it, you may be able to struggle through it, you're not sure you're getting it right. It's scary. And none of us jump to do things that are hard for us, right? If we can put it off, we will. But if they can just pick up the phone and answer the questions on the phone, that's a lot easier for them. So if you've got low literacy parents, I really encourage you to get them to respond by phone. I think they're going to do it, they're much more likely to do it, and they'll do a better job because they'll finish it, they'll work their way all the way through. And the other thing you can do, because it is our first internet census, is set up tablets or laptops where people, if you're doing group events now, you guys mostly go into family homes. If you're taking a tablet, have them fill it out on your tablet if you've got internet access. But also if you do community events, set up laptops and tablets where people can fill it out there, because they can fill it out even if they don't have their form in front of them. What are we going to produce to support you in this? Like I said, we're going to produce posters, flyers. We do have one video. It's actually downstairs on display in the display area. And we're going to make more social media toolkits. There may be a national launch event in March. There will be PSAs. There may be Sesame Street PSAs. There will be materials in multiple languages. So there will be lots of tools that you can use. You don't have to create them. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. We have a fact sheet on when to count young children that's really detailed. There's a simpler one from the Census Bureau. So if you have questions, who should count this child? Does this child that spends some of their time with me, should I count them? Do I count a pregnancy? Do I count the baby if they're still in the hospital? It's all spelled out on that fact sheet. We're putting together one for providers to answer lots of provider questions. As I said, the Hard to Count map will show communities at high risk of missing young children. And I'm hoping that after we've all presented, that we'll be able to talk about what else you need. These are some resources that you can use that are useful websites to go to. One is the Count All Kids website, which I talked about before, and that's where you sign up for the campaign materials. We also have Census Counts, which has resources from the communities. The National Conference of American Indians materials will be accessible there as well as on their own website. Materials for reaching out to the Arab community. And then I've given you the link for the preschool materials on the statistics in schools. Is Lizette back in the room yet? Okay. Yeah. While we're waiting for Lizette, does anyone else have questions? If not, I'll skip her slides and we'll have Yvette talk next. Okay, we've got a question in the back and then the lady in the blue sweater.
So I know you were mentioning before that we should kind of think of this native, for example, we do food connection. Now, is there like a specific type of certification or training that we should do if we're planning on assisting families in doing those things, or is it something that we're just able to do just kind of like?
So that's a really good question. The question was, is there a training, or you should kind of just go for it when you're doing community events? We're getting an increasing number of requests for that kind of support, and what I'm trying to put together now is two things. One would be a short video for a training for people to do, and another is, if you're not comfortable with it, a short video you can just show families. So I don't know for sure that will happen, but that is one of our goals. The lady in blue, and then we'll go to Lizette.
Are they going to be hiring people to help with the census? Because we help families, and some of our families can't read and write in their home language, and maybe benefit from having a job.
So they are hiring. They need to hire hundreds of thousands of people, literally. I don't know that they will hire illiterate people. They would have to hire people who were literate to go work with the others. Yeah, right. They hire people to go knock on the doors of the families who haven't responded. And in theory, at least, they're looking for people who come from those communities. All census hiring is done through the census website. They are having a hard time hiring because the economy is so good that there aren't that many people looking for jobs. One of the things you can do to both support parents and other people in your community and to make sure your community gets counted better is to encourage people to apply for those jobs. Absolutely. They pay really well, I'm told. Right. I mean, it is, and it's kind of flexible hours, but I mean, it's short-term work, obviously. It's not a permanent job, but it is a good job to recommend to people, and it will also help get the communities counted. Lizette? Yeah?
I don't know if it may have been answered already, that stepped out, but what do you guys do for those 10 years of those children are born between, like, for instance, 2010 to 2020? How do you count those children?
So
Can you repeat the question?
the question was, what happens to kids who are born after the census and do they get counted? So there's two ways to think about that. One is when you're actually looking at decennial estimates. The Bureau does do estimates based on the numbers they collected in 2010 that include projections of how many kids were born for decennial data. The other is, remember I said that they do other surveys which are samples? So, those surveys go on all 10 years, but those communities won't get enough samples out of them if we don't count everybody who is alive in 2010. So, was that? For some reason, it keeps popping up a thing saying, do you want to?
So just use.
I mean, you should be, it won't do either. Just tell it no when it pops up and it'll keep moving, but it'll stop the slides.
Awesome. Alrighty, so my name is Lisette Escobedo. My apologies for stepping in and out. Every day you think today might just be a normal day. And then you get an article on Bloomberg about something. And with that, also to say that we're going to need as much help as possible. I think we're pretty tired, but we keep going. But I think this is, for Latinos, this is one of the most challenging census pretty much in like the history of the decennial census. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But again, all that to say that we need a lot of help. And so as I'm going through the slides, one of the important things is to think about how can I include census as part of the work that I do? How can I include some of this information as part of the work that I do? We always tell folks, you know your community best. You know what works, what doesn't. You know your workload. And so, as you come up with ideas, new ideas, out of the box ideas, is what's going to work this census. That's what we've been saying. So again, my name is Lisette Escobedo, Director of the National Census Program at the NALEO Educational Fund. I'm going to tell you a little bit about NALEO because I realized I didn't include an About Us slide here. But the NALEO Educational Fund does its work in a couple of ways. So our primary mission is to engage Latinos in the democratic process from citizenship to public service. We do that in a couple of ways. One, we do it through civic engagement work, where we engage Latinos in voter participation, election protection, making sure that their vote is protected and that they have access to the polls. We do that through citizenship work. So we work with the over 9 million legal permanent residents that are eligible to become citizens that haven't become citizens yet. And so we work with a lot of the population there. And I'll bring this up a little bit as well, but there tends to be this myth that you go from being undocumented to a citizen. And that's not how the immigration process works. There is legal permanent residency that comes before that. You're a legal permanent resident between 3 to 5 years, and then you qualify to apply for citizenship. And that's the process that we help with across the country. We have a voter information, voter protection hotline, citizenship hotline, a census hotline. We also do census work, which is my primary focus. I worked in every single space of the Civic Engagement Department for NALEO back in the day after I came back. But that's how we do a lot of our community work. Now we have what we call Constituency Services, which is where we train Latino elected and appointed officials. So one thing is to make sure that we have Latino representation in our communities. And another thing is to make sure that they have the tools, resources, and information and good governance skills to lead for our communities. And so our constituency services, a lot of the work that they do is various institutes on school governance, on education policy, on emergency preparedness. The majority of our members are actually school board members. And then the last piece of our work is our policy research and advocacy work, which is where we do a lot of advocacy for more funding, for voter outreach programs, for census outreach programs, and the program that is near and dear to the heart of our CEO is the census, and to mine too. So we're all a little bit of census nerds here. And I'll apologize because I think Deb and I and the rest of the folks have been traveling a lot to do this work. And so aside from being a little bit tired, I also lost my glasses in my last travel. So if I can't see something, my apologies if I pronounce it wrong, but I'm pretty sure I know this by heart. So the census consistently undercounts children. A lot of this Deb already talked about. One of the primary populations that's important to us is Latino children, right? And so we realized that young Latino children were undercounted 7.1% compared to 4.3% for non-Latinos. So not only the Latino population, but Latino children are consistently undercounted at a higher rate than most populations. Approximately, so Deb talked about the 1 million that were left off in 2010. Out of those 1 million, 40% were Latino children, 400,000. And I'll go over the state breakdowns in just a bit. And so, because one of the things that how we talk about a lot of this work, because sometimes we go and we do presentations and folks say, well, that's great, for the Latino population, et cetera, but, what about in general, right? However, the way that we think about it is Latinos are the second largest population in the country. They're 40% of the children that were left undercounted. So if Latinos are undercounted, all of our communities are undercounted, right? We're everywhere now. And so we have to look at it from the holistic point of view. Making sure that Latinos are counted is making sure that all of our communities have resources. So Deb talked a little bit about this as well. One of the interesting points, and I come across this in my own family, where someone says, well, I get that the census is important, but I'm not really into politics, right? When you start trying to, I try to talk census all the time. And so it's very important to bring this up because if you drive, if you get health care, if your kids go to a school, if you walk on a pavement, the census impacts your daily life in your community. So it's not just about making sure that everyone's counted for the sake of redistricting, for the sake of a congressional seat. It's making sure that everyone in your community is counted to make sure that you have the resources that you need for vital services. So as you can see, it impacts all the way from college ed to early childhood education to, again, transportation and infrastructure. Interestingly, when we observed some of the focus groups in LA with another one of our partners, in LA, their primary reason for filling out the census was transportation infrastructure. For those of us from LA, we had a lot of potholes, right? So that came up first for a lot of folks, right? So it doesn't matter what community, you'll see a connection, but it's really important to realize that there's over $800 billion at stake here. Now, in terms of the net undercount for Latino children, the state with the largest undercount was California. Now, sure, California is a state where we've allocated the most amount of funds for census outreach. California allocated about $187 million. Does anyone know what Texas allocated by any chance? Or Florida? Any guesses? Zero. Right. So $0. So there's states that, yes, they have the hardest to count communities. They're going to be a challenge when it comes to children, but there is an effort from the state to make sure that outreach is being done. So in California, for example, all of your counties had access to an RFP from the state. So LAUSD, which is LA Unified School District, will serve as every school and every district office will actually serve as an information center for the census, right? So a lot of what we want to think about is how do we take those models to other states? Now, Texas, which allocated 0, we had an undercount of 75,000, a net undercount, 75,000 Latino children. Then Florida comes next. Miami-Dade School District actually is one of the districts with the largest undercount of Latino children. Again, there are certain things that, when the state hasn't stepped up, that districts, counties, and cities are having to do. So in Miami-Dade, you do have school board members who are actually allocating funds to try and do some outreach. But $25,000 for outreach is not the same as $187 million, right? So every state is a little bit different, but again, you see our primary states of focus will be California, Texas, Florida, Arizona, New York, and interestingly, Georgia. That one is compared to 2010, this is somewhat of a new state for us in terms of doing work. And so, we're gonna need all the help we can get because these, as Deb mentioned, it wasn't that these households weren't counted, it was the fact that the children were left off. And so we're trying to do more research to look into why that was for Latino households specifically. And we know kind of in general, right? Like because if the child wasn't included in the tax form or because the child is under 18, there's just this assumption. But we want to delve a little bit deeper with Latino households to see if that's the same indicator. Now, in terms of county, where you saw the largest net undercount, again, Los Angeles County. Los Angeles County dedicated another docket of funds to the work already happening. And then you do have a strong philanthropic network there who allocated even more to make sure that the communities there are counted. However, LA County is one of the counties with the hardest to count Latino populations in the entire country. And so it kind of matches up with the undercount of Latinos. Maricopa being the next one. This one was interesting for us because it wasn't, we thought maybe Orange County in California, maybe San Diego County. It's Maricopa County. Maricopa County is a pretty young county. And so we started doing a lot of work out there, but again, it's really gonna take all of us. Miami-Dade, Dallas, New York, and then Clark County stuck out for us because it wasn't it wasn't kind of in your top states for Latino hard to count states, but it was in your top counties in terms of hard to count young children. And so this is where we want to put some emphasis, some focus, and really understand that these were potential resources lost in these cities and these counties specifically. Yes?
I work in Cook County, Illinois, and I can tell you that the local communities, especially through the chambers of commerce, are already pushing census counts and reaching out to some of the not-for-profits, some of the visiting organizations to partner with them because they are very panicked. We have one community that has 54,000 people, and if they fall under that 50,000, they lose a rep. Mm-hmm. And so they're panicked. And so the local towns are actually not waiting for the county or the state to get on board. They're actually reaching out already.
Right. So for the folks who didn't hear, we were talking about Cook County and Illinois and how there's efforts launched there. The state of Illinois as well, the legislature there has also passed funding to do work. So Illinois is in a better place. I think one of the challenges that we're seeing in our communities is even for us, right? So for example, we have a template resolution for our school board members. We've gotten at least 30 of them signed in different school districts. And then they say, that's great. We said we're gonna focus on the census. Now what do? Right? So this is like the second phase for us. And so we're having to think through, okay, aside from coming together in meetings, and aside from forming committees, like what are some tangible things that we can do? And I'm gonna talk a little bit about that when I go over our messaging research. And I'll talk a little bit about what we did in 2010 as well. Because believe it or not, it doesn't, especially for folks who work with children, It doesn't take a massive heavy lift in terms of pulling together a completely separate program. All it really is sometimes is talking to parents, at least for Latinos. Because Latinos, we listen to whoever works with our kids, the teachers, the principals. Growing up, if your teacher told your parent that you weren't doing well, like that was it. It wasn't even the priest, it was the teacher. So I'll talk a little bit about that and what we learned about that in our message research. I'll take one more and then I'll move into the slide. Yes?
I'm not even sure how to ask this question, but how do you know the kids aren't being counted if they weren't counted? I mean, how do you know that 6,000 kids were left off of a count in a certain county if, it's like you don't know what you don't know. How do you know that there's 6,000 kids missing if you don't know they're there?
Right, so this was through research, and I don't know, Deb would probably be better to answer it, but it is through certain estimates and research, yeah.
So it's actually, it's very interesting. They have one approach for figuring out how many adults are missed, which involves going back and counting, talking to households a second time. That doesn't work at all for kids, but they have a strategy that works really well for kids under 10 and not so much after that. They compare it to the birth rate, the death rate, and the net immigration rate. And that's how we know they missed everybody. The problem is we can't use that birth and death rate data for things like determining federal funding or determining representation in, legislative redistricting. But they're very confident of how many they missed. Those are Census Bureau numbers, and it's because we can compare the number of kids that were born, the number of kids that were died, and how many kids either moved in or out of the country and those communities when they're young. Now, you can't do that as much when people are older because people move so much in this country, but when they're young, they are much less likely to have moved. So that's how they know. And people are pretty sure that that's what we missed.
So they find the hard data, but then it doesn't influence the dollars.
They are not legally allowed to use other kinds of data to do the federal redistricting or the state or local redistricting. There's a Supreme Court case about that. And the formulas for allocating federal dollars also require it to be the census data and not other administrative data. They are trying for the first time in the census to get administrative records to identify families that they then need to really follow up with in the census itself, but it has to be information that comes in through the census process. Does that help?
Alrighty, so it's important to note that we've actually never had an accurate count ever in any census, right? Because we've always had these very hard to count communities. Now, the interesting piece about this is that for the Latino community, when you look at all of the hard to count characteristics, we kind of fall in all of them in terms of majority population. So folks who are usually undercounted, again, people of color, African Americans, Latinos, American Indians, households with low incomes, immigrants and individuals with low English language proficiency. This time will be very different for our immigrant community. From what we've seen, this includes both documented and undocumented. There's just a sense of fear for obvious reasons. Renters, residents who live in non-traditional housing, rural residents, highly mobile residents, and then again, very young children aged 0 to 4. The Latino population is actually pretty young. Our median age is about 28 years old, which is 10 years less than the general average. And so again, by all the characteristics, our community is and will continue to be one of the hardest to count communities, especially this census. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of this heightened sense of fear because we're living different times now. I talked a little bit about this already in terms of, Latino children being 40% of the net undercount for children in general. Now, some of the specific aspects, and Debbie talked about this a little bit, in terms of why children are usually undercounted and which children are usually undercounted. So it's usually young children living in rental units. It's young children living in households that were not enumerated by self-response. So there's a difference between self-response and non-response follow-up. This time that's going to be extremely crucial and important. I'll talk about it in a couple of slides. But the more we can encourage parents to self-respond in that process, the highly likely it is that they'll make themselves count, the higher likely it is. young children living with younger householder, young children living in low-income households, young children living in very small household, very large, moved in the past year, living with a grandparent born in 3 months before Census Day. So as we look at these, one of the things that one of the aspects or strategies that we've been working on is how do we tap into all this information that we're being given here and give that back to the community, right? So some of the materials that we're working on is, for example, posters that will allow folks to identify, you know, hey, I'm living with my grandparent or with my foster parents. They should count me. I'm with my mom on April 1st, 2020. I need to make sure she counts me. So a lot of this information, again, it's how do we take this and bring it back to the community and inform them that regardless of the situation, that children needs to be counted. We often get questions around shared custody, right? If the child is 50-50 and the child is with the mother on April 1st, 2020, we say that's where you count, right? And so it's really important that we can answer a lot of these questions. These are the questions that have come up for us with parents and with educators. But in essence, you're kind of looking at every type of young child is usually undercounted. Yes?
What about all the homeless? Because I know LA is one of the highest homeless rates in the state.
Right. And there will be a homeless count in 2020. I believe it's like 3 days, where they do a homeless count. So there's the homeless count that the Census Bureau will be doing in operation. And then there's also a count of group quarters. Where they kind of go into the homeless shelters, work with the administrators. Yeah, that's where they do the 3 days where they actually go out and enumerate the homeless folks. So there's a particular effort, but again, the more that we can encourage folks to self-respond, the better. There is separate operations in essence for the homeless community. Oops, what did I do? Okay, there you go. Sorry, this computer's not cooperating with me. So again, we talked a little bit about the implications of an undercount. Again, we're looking at implications with women and infants and children's programs. We're looking at implication when it comes to not just meal programs and education programs, but there's also things like community development block grants, which provide grants to cities for other type of community programs as well. We're also looking at workforce programs that allow youth to enter the workforce. All of these programs are influenced by census data in particular. So again, it kind of impacts every particular area of our community. 62% of young Latino children, more than 11 million boys and girls, currently live in or near poverty. So that also plays a major factor. And again, if we are a community of, if we have 30 children and we're counting 20 and we're getting resources for 20, right? And I know that's not exactly how the formulas work, but this is how I explain it to a lot of the parents, where they're like, pero por qué you have 30 children, you get resources for 20, you're leaving in essence 10 behind, or you're having to spread for 20 for your 30 kids. So less resources for our community, and a community that's already living in poverty and already has particular needs. And we do have, and I don't know if folks are gonna get this PowerPoint, but we do have a report linked of some of the findings that we have for Latino children specifically, which our report is called the Invisible Ones. Again, this has been particularly helpful when we work with a lot of our school board members. So it's been interesting working with various kind of school boards and school districts, which has been a lot of our work, because you realize how much of this isn't communicated to them. So a lot of what we've been doing is really informing them, like, okay, what does Title I actually mean? So Title I means that if you have an undercount, you have less funding for school-based planning, you have less funding for promoting parental participation, you have less funding for coordination with health and social services agencies. And so for us, it was really important for us to kind of break this down to our school board members and the administrators to make sure that they understood that It wasn't just this sense of federal funding for education, but it was very particular programs that would be influenced by that, which is your Title I grants. Sorry. Okay. There you go. So here's the interesting part of my presentation. So we did do some research. We did some focus groups with various Latino communities. So we did emerging areas. So we did a couple of focus groups in North Carolina. And then we did Latino high density areas in Texas. And then we did some work in, we didn't do California, we did Texas. But we did English speakers, Spanish speakers, first generation immigrants, second generation. We did undocumented, sort of, we don't really ask that in the focus group, so we had to kind of gather that. But here was a mix, and folks should know that with the Latino community, and this is something that I'm always asked about in terms of messaging for Latinos, in terms of like what are the entertainers that influence Latinos. We're very nuanced and we're very complex. We're not monolithic. And so it's important to note that while this research provides some insight, general insight, when we go to various communities, it can vary all the way down from nationality. How we say one word in Spanish if you're Mexican is a little bit different than if you're Cuban. It's a little bit different when you're Afro-Latino than when you're, Texan, third generation, right? And so there's a lot of these nuances that you might know more in terms of your community, but these are just some general points that we discovered through our research. So focus group participants generally had a positive view of the census. They know it's a good thing, which is a plus. That doesn't mean that they said they would fill it out. Survey respondents overwhelmingly expressed preference to complete the census by mail or on paper form. We suspect that this might somewhat change. We have some research coming up, a refresher research in December and January, because some of what we started seeing is actually that filling out the census form online might provide some more convenience. Messages about census participation being convenient, safe, and required showed the most positive response. The messages about the role of the census data in providing funding for local schools and community programs were amongst the most effective in the focus groups. However, again, convenient, safe, and required was the most effective. Family members were amongst the most trusted messengers, right? So we often, and even when we brainstorm on like census campaigns, we always think about like, oh, what are some, athletes and entertainers that we can get to influence. I had my heart set on Cardi B. It's not happening. But those aren't the most trusted messengers in the Latino community, to be very honest. It's actually Latina women in the household. So if you, and it's interesting because even in our voter engagement work that we've done, when we have the GOTV list, we call the woman in the household first, because it's highly likely that she will get everyone in that household to vote, right? So for Latinos specifically, it's the women in the household, but it's every kind of family member. I can say it till I'm blue in the face, please, it's important, the census, but if the mom or the sister or even the brother comes and says it, it's highly likely that they will participate. Yes?
How are you educating on the census, like what the census is?
So I'll go over that in a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about our campaign. So I'll save that for then. Another piece that we discovered is nurses, doctors, health providers, Latino community organizations, faith leaders also falls within this, are amongst the most highly trusted messengers. And then the last point, which is very important for this group, is people who speak for the children or the school, such as teachers, were especially trusted and convincing. And so even with our voter engagement work for Latinos, it's folks that speak for the children, it's faith leaders, and it's family members. So again, as much as we want to get, and every time you have a kind of a planning call. It's always like, who would be willing to do it? Who can tap into this singer? And it's like, well, you know, for Latinos, it's honestly just talk to the mom. When my mom group texts us about voting, like, you got to do it because she's going to call you later, right? So that's really important. Can anyone guess, according to our research for Latinos, who were amongst the least trusted? Any guesses is a good guess. No guesses? Elected officials, which is weird because we are the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials. Now, when we worked with the folks at the Leadership Conference, they actually, according to their research in the African American community, elected officials are actually amongst the most trusted, because they usually help them organize, they get them elected, and so they trust them, they go to their office, they talk to them all the time. With Latinos, a lot of folks also come with their views from their home country, where kind of politicians do nothing, right, aside from take. So they tend not to be, I mean, we still work with our elected officials, but unfortunately, that's what we discovered. Now, immigrants were especially responsive to the convenience, safety, and required message, with 75% saying that they would definitely participate in response to this message. Women were the most responsive to the civic civic and community duty message, with 57% saying that they would definitely participate. Latinos under the age of 40 were most responsive to the resistance message, with 53% saying they would definitely participate and respond to the message. So this is what I'm talking about when I say our community is very nuanced and complex. For our immigrant population, a lot of the resistance message actually doesn't work that well. Most of our, and in our focus group, we've realized that actually the immigrants in our focus group were more positive and optimistic about the future outlook, whereas millennial Latinos have a major distrust for government. So they will be one of our biggest challenges, even more so sometimes than, especially if you're looking at your documented immigrant community, which tend to even be more optimistic. Our major challenge is millennial men. Now, for Spanish speakers, Spanish language media was amongst the most trusted source of information. For younger participants, they had more favorable views of social media as a source of information. 85% of survey participants were regularly or daily online via smartphones. So this is very important because Latinos are smartphone users, constant smartphone users. So whenever we're sending emails, whenever we're posting something on the website, we want to make sure that they're able to view via mobile. And that's very important because when we talk to them about the fact that they could fill out the form using their phone, by being connected to the internet, that tends to kind of spark an interest in them. Survey participants frequently search online. Most effective means of communication digitally is email and Facebook. We're generally not on Twitter, to be very honest with you. I love Twitter, I retweet all the time, but that's not where Latinos are at. So in terms of like the work that we're doing, we're focusing the majority of our digital efforts on Facebook. Again, so a little bit of what we kind of uncovered in this research, and it was very minimal because we need to dedicate just a little bit more time to finding out why folks are feeling this way. But households with children age 17 and younger, 53% of survey respondents stated that they have one or more children under the age of 17 or younger in the household. Among respondents with children age 17 and younger in the home, 11% said they would not count them or do not know if they would. Households with age 4 and younger, 24% of survey respondents stated that they had a child age 4 or younger, and amongst those respondents, 15% said that they would not count them or don't know if they would. So that's key. Those are pretty large percentages when you consider the fact that most of them had a generally positive view of the census. So this is very important because although the citizenship question will no longer be on, and when working with the Latino community, your very first step is if you tell someone every day that you see them, do it. The citizenship question will not be on the census form. The last focus group that we observed, out of the about 9 people, 8 of the folks there thought that the question was still on. So the very first step is actually reassuring the community that the citizenship question will not be on. But why was it so important for the Latino community? The census officials estimate that 6.5 million residents would not have responded to the questionnaire if the question would have been on the actual form. In a survey conducted by the NLA Educational Fund, 78% of Latinos stated that the inclusion of the citizenship question would make people afraid to participate in Census 2020. This is both immigrants and non-immigrants. In terms of the sentiment with non-immigrants, and I'll use the statement of we felt like it was a direct attack. And so there's still kind of that lingering feeling. And on the form, you still do have 2 questions, one that asks about race and one that asks about Hispanic origin. And so in our community, there's a sense that, are they asking me to still try to find out where I'm at, which is scary to think about that. Well, scary to think that our community is thinking that this is how we're going to get targeted, right? But it is something that we're going to have to work on. So the Census Bureau, again, will conduct non-response follow-up to households that do not self-response. That means an enumerator may call or visit a household that does not complete their form. This is all very important information. So 1 is to remind folks that the census is important. 2 is to remind folks that the census is safe and secure. 3 is to make sure that we know basic information on what's going to happen, right? 1, they're going to have the opportunity for self-response, but if they don't self-respond, yes, there will be an enumerator knocking on their door. And so the best way to avoid an enumerator knocking at their door is to self-respond. We're using the date of April 30th, 2020, because there will be fear in our community. The majority of the questions that we're getting, even through our hotline, is, I don't want anyone coming to my door because I don't trust government, right? What if it's ICE? So we say, just fill it out on your own before April 30th, 2020. So that's kind of a date that we've been using. We will, on our end, we will work to educate the community and about details with non-response follow-up and assistance guidelines, but it's very important that once we start talking to the community, let them know when an enumerator goes out, they will have a badge with the Census Bureau logo. 2, they will never ask you for bank account information, social security number, immigration status. 3, for the most part, they will not ask you to go into your home, right? So all these things, as minor as they seem, these are very important to make sure that our community is educated not just on the process, but knows what to look out for and can protect themselves as well. In the lead up to the 2010 census, our national hotline, 877-NET-CENSO, which is an active hotline now. If you forget everything about today's panel and you want to remember one thing to give back to your community in terms of information, just say, hey, you know what, I learned a bunch of stuff, it was very cool, but it was a lot, but just call 877-NET-CENSO, they'll answer your questions. We're live since June. And so there, folks will also be able to report any inconsistencies or anomalies that we're seeing, because we will be working with the Lawyers Committee, with MALDEF, with Asian Americans Advancing Justice to see if there's any kind of legal things that come up. Then we want to make sure that we're proactively reporting those. Yes. I think we're almost done. I can go on and on about this because, again, I nerd out on all this stuff. A rapid response plan will be put in place to address reports by any potential, again, impersonators or misinformation. In the state of California, we actually have a bill up in the legislature for census impersonators. If anyone tries to impersonate the census, aside from the kind of Title 13 fines, there are additional fines and potential jail time in California based on a bill that legislators are passing. We can do that in other states. If folks want to talk to me, we can connect you to our California state legislatures. Very important. This, interestingly, I kind of just pulled together last minute, like months ago, and it has become one of the most important slides because folks don't know what the form's going to look like. And there's all this, for Latinos, we saw it on Univision every day. We saw it at Telemundo every day, the citizenship question and Trump and ICE raids in Mississippi. This is all that's going to be on there. So even if they were to want to do anything with your data, this is the only data they're asking you for. So it's very important that we take this back to our community. Number of people living in the household, sex, age, date of birth, Hispanic origin, and race. We will be dedicating a significant amount of efforts in educating our community on why Hispanic origin is important. For us, it's important for the sake of implementation of key civil rights laws and protections. And so we actually fought to get that question on there. So it's very important to communicate that. What they will not ask, also very important, not citizenship status, social security number, use of public benefits. We have the public charge rule now that says that folks can apply for residency if they receive some type of benefit. So they say, well, are they gonna ask me that on the census questionnaire? And will it affect with this public charge rule? No, they don't ask that. No criminal background or convictions, bank account or payment information. So these, even though these are very small tidbits, very important for our community. And so this is what we're giving to our community as part of our efforts. They will never ask to enter your home. They will identify themselves and wear a U.S. Census Bureau badge. We will be doing an extensive amount of work, and my apologies, because I know I need to wrap up, so I'm gonna kind of just go through these. We will be doing an extensive amount of work with Spanish language media. We started already, where during non-response follow-up in May of next year, we will be doing what we did in 2010, which is take some enumerators into the studio, have them talk about their process. What are they gonna ask? What do they look like? What will they not ask? So all of that is very, very important. So a lot of our focus is Spanish language media and trying to capture mass audience to convey this information. But again, when in doubt, a parent asks you, someone from your community asks you, those are the things that they will not ask, and hopefully we can get you all this presentation to have that handy. What are some of the things that you can do aside from what Deb already mentioned? Faith-based organizations, local businesses, but specifically people working with children and with parents will be particularly important. To us, honestly, it's those main three things that I kind of talked about. One, the census is safe and secure. Two, the citizenship question will not be on. Three, if you have any questions, call 877-CENSO. And then these are all the reasons why the census is important. Sometimes when we work with educators, they always express to us, we have so much going on already. We have Common Core standards, we have all these things, and so you're asking me to insert kind of this other curriculum. I don't know if that's what I can do. And so we try to work with, okay, plug it in how you see fit and deem fit as part of your effort. And so we just provide you with the resources. We do all this through the shirt that I have on, which is our Hágase Contar campaign. We will be doing Train the Trainers across the country starting in January. We're planning about 20. We've divided up the country in about 5 regions, and we're gonna be going everywhere. It's about a 5-hour training that takes you all through operations and in essence makes you a trainer for your community and someone that can inform your community about the census. We're doing public information efforts as part of what we're doing here. Our most important is our 877-CENSO hotline, national bilingual hotline. We have paid staff on there, so we're live all the time. We also have hagasecontar.org, bilingual website, where you can download key resources, print them out, take them with you. We have a massive communications toolkit. Feel free to adapt and use as you need. We do all of our work for the undercount of children under our Hazme Contar campaign. Again, this campaign specifically focuses on the undercount of Latino children. We do have some sample PowerPoints for parent educators. We have sample PowerPoints for parent leaders. And so in essence, it's really a PowerPoint you get that's already ready and you just go and present it to the community. So all of our tools are turnkey, plug and play. What's easiest for you to do this work? This particular slide, hopefully you all get it, but this is all hyperlinked. So you literally just click on each of these bullets, whatever you want to download, and you'll have access to it. Most of this material is bilingual. And again, we're building materials that will not add on to your work, but complement and add the message to your work. Some other key things that folks can do are up here. We do have regional census managers in all of your key Latino states across the country, California being obviously one of our biggest operations, where we have 5 regional census managers throughout the state. If folks want to receive constant updates, what's going on, how do I, what has been released in terms of the toolkit, our opt-in, our census opt-in, texting census to 97779 we do rapid text. So you get a link to tools, everything that we release, you get on there. And so that's a really helpful, I think we just launched it when I came on board, but I love mass SMS. I nerd out for digital tools. But here are all our resources and things that folks can do. Again, I already went over our Hágase Contar website, our hotline. Here are some functions that we have. Key census dates, I think Deb went over those already, right? And then we're going to be focusing some particular dates on educating folks on the census. So think about, what do you have coming up? What appreciation days? We're going to be focusing on National Caregivers Month in November to really talk about the importance of caregivers and the importance of caregivers and counting those that they care for. And so think about, how do you use all these months and all these messages to tap into or to add the census message into what you're already doing, which is what we've done with all of our key dates. We will be launching some work on the count of Latinas during the Women's March week to focus on the importance of Latinas to the country and why they should be counted. And then there is my contact information. I know I went very fast and I didn't bring business cards today, but feel free to email me and I'm happy to help folks out with whatever their needs are. And I'm sure I went over the 5 minutes, but that's it for me. Yeah.
No, we're going to have to hold.
Yeah.
We have one more presenter.
So we get the next presenter. Right? Okay. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all today. I'm going to try to do my presentation in 10 minutes so we can get some questions in for the end, so hold those questions that you have. Well, again, I'm Dr. Yvette Rubidoux. I am a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. I am also Standing Rock Sioux, and I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm with the National Congress of American Indians. I'm the Vice President for Research and the Director of the Ncaa Policy Research Center. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak at this great conference. I saw the agenda. It looks wonderful. And I want to thank all of you in the room for the really important work you do for all of our children. I know you work hard. I know that you have busy times and the work can be challenging, but I want you to know that I appreciate each and every one of you for the great work that you do. I'm so pleased to be here today to have the opportunity to talk about what we're doing to try to ensure that every American Indian and Alaska Native is counted in the 2020 census, especially the children. And I'll talk a little bit about how you can help. All right, so I'm talking about three things today. Review a little information about the American Indian and Alaska Native population, provide an overview of the National Congress of American Indians Census message testing, and then describe our Indian Country Counts campaign. Sorry, things popping up. Describe our Indian Country Counts campaign to get out the count for the 2020 census. All right, just a little bit about our organization. We were established in 1944. We're the oldest, largest, and most representative national organization serving the broad interests of American Indian and Alaska Native tribes. Our mission focuses on protecting and upholding sovereignty, and we're focused in Washington, D.C. The population of American Indians and Alaska Natives, how many of you come across American and Alaska Native children in your work? All right. Great. So glad to see that. Well, the population is made up of a lot of different types of people. So there's 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and they're located in 35 states. These tribes are sovereign nations, and they set their own criteria for who can be a member of the tribe. But there's also over 200 state-recognized tribes, and of course there's people who identify as American Indian Alaska Native who may or may not be members of tribes. And American Indians and Alaska Natives live in rural and urban areas. They're literally everywhere, and so I'm not surprised many of you run into them, but at the National Congress of American Indians, we focus on ensuring that the federal government meets its responsibility to provide the resources that the treaties promised, and census data, it has to do a lot about making sure the resources are accurate. All right, so in the 2010 census, there were about 5.2 million American Indians and Alaska Natives, about 1.7% of the population. But different from the prior slide, the census is a self-report. So it's whoever self-reports or self-identifies as American Indian or Alaska Native. It doesn't ask about enrollment or anything like that. However, it does ask you to report your tribe, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. So if you look at these numbers, of up here, about a third of the numbers of the population are children under the age of 18. So we have a very young population, so that's why your work is so critical to help sure that all children are counted, even American Indian and Alaska Native children. But again, it's self-report data. This is what the race question looks like. I've put an arrow by what they ask for American Indian, Alaska Native. Again, it's self-report, check the box. And then in 2010, you've had the opportunity to write in your enrolled or principal tribe. And in 2020, they actually made the form have some examples of what to write in. And also, there's more characters. And so it's really important if the household wants to be counted as an American Indian and Alaska Native household, the first person that fills out the form has to check the box for American Indian and Alaska Natives. So that's a really important thing to do. But a complete count is what we want, but it's going to be difficult because American Indians and Alaska Natives also are a hard-to-count population. The net undercount rate of American Indians living on reservations in 2010 was 4.9%, and 26% of American Indians and Alaska Natives live in hard-to-count census tracts. And as you've heard with the prior speakers, there's lots of risk factors for being in a hard-to-count population. For American Indians and Alaska Natives, those include the risk factors that are listed on this slide: poverty, lower educational attainment, housing insecurity, literacy, and a younger population. And we've already learned a lot about why younger populations are harder to count. So the National Congress of American Indians, we conducted message testing for our population to determine if we need to have different messages for the 2020 campaign, given the climate that we have now. We did focus groups in 3 distinct regions of the country with individuals who self-reported that they were American Indian Alaska Native who lived in a rural or reservation area within the last 10 years. And in the end, about a little over half of our participants had actually participated in the census in prior years. So our results, they said the best way to participate would be mailed or online, less door-to-door, and definitely not by phone. So those were interesting results. But which is really relevant for this audience. Community outreach and trusted entities were really critical to help encourage to do the census. But the challenges to participation are similar, concerns about, well, the data is not accurate, distrust in government, that's big for American Indians and Alaska Natives as well, low aware of purpose of the census, prior claims not being delivered. So a really important message not to say is, oh, if you do the census, you'll get more resources. Because people are like, well, I filled it out in 2010 and I'm still poor. So it's more about getting the more accurate data to make sure you're counted. All right, and then literacy issues as well. We also looked at some messages, and the things that were most compelling were about family and generations, as well as being visible. American Indians are sort of invisible to a lot of people. And you can see that some of the moderately compelling messages were about being heard and were about resources. So what I'd like to tell you is what we're doing with the National Congress of American Indians to try to get out the count and to try to make sure that everybody from elders to babies is counted in the 2020 census. All right, so our messaging is, why should you participate in the census? This is for our family and generations now and for the future. We need to be counted. We need to be visible. We need to be heard. We need accurate data when resources are on the line, and we need accurate data for our votes to matter. And our tagline is our nations, our people, and our future. So the core components of our campaign are a public education and outreach campaign where we're trying to educate about the census because there's a lot of lack of awareness about basically what it is. Second, coalition building, working with other groups and other partners to try to make sure we can get an accurate count. Community engagement to have tribal nations and American Indian and Alaska Native organizations to be a part of this to help get activities going to encourage people to answer the census. And we're also working on combating misinformation. You know, on social media now there's false things all the time, and we don't want people to get scared because of false things. And so we're trying to combat that misinformation. So we have, this is what our toolkit looks like. We're updating it now, so a new version should be up on our website soon. We have other resources on our website, and it's indiancountrycounts.org, and we'll be updating it with information on jobs and region and specific information and other things like that. Oh, geez, this thing. All right. The other neat thing that we're trying to help motivate people is to join the pledge. And the pledge is a commitment to take action and help get out the count in Indian country. And if you do, you get one of these customized T-shirts with it says, I am from your tribal nation, and I count. So for me, it would be, I am Rosebud Sioux, and I count. People love these T-shirts, and so they're flying out the door right now. We're actually at our conference coming up next week going to have a station where people can get the T-shirts made. And then we have those little feather fans, because you can fan yourself. So we're trying to figure out the kind of swag that would really work to help motivate people. And there are ways to purchase these items in bulk on our website. But really important is the coalition building and the community engagement. It's really critical since trusted entities are needed to help encourage people to fill out the form. We really need people in the community to help, and these are just pictures from prior activities. And then we talked about this earlier. You can be a census taker, and there's actually a place to apply online with the census, and it's on my slide. I don't know if the slide is in the app. But we know that definitely this is a good job that someone can have to make sure your community gets counted. And then finally, some of the things we're doing recently, we have our Ncaa annual convention is next week. That's why I seem a little tired. We're getting ready for that. But we're holding trainings. Many of the individuals who work on census also work on the native vote in our communities, so we're inviting them for a training to come up with civic engagement plans. We just issued a call for mini grants so that communities can get small amounts of money to get out the count efforts. We're partnering with the Center for Native American Youth and Generation Indigenous on a creative art competition. So we're announcing the winner of that soon. We're working closely with the U.S. Census Bureau for lots of reasons and their tribal partnership program. And coming soon, we're going to have a civic engagement summit and an ad campaign for our Indian Counts campaign. And so I hope that you can, in your work, you've gotten enough information today to help you know where you can get more resources to help us make sure that everybody's counted, everybody from our elders all the way down to our little babies, because those counts are important. This count only happens once every 10 years, and it's so critical in voting and resources and just being visible. So thank you for being here today, and I hope you can join us in these efforts. Thank you. I think now we'll take questions for all of us.
Yeah, so if you have additional questions, and I'll probably ask the presenters to come up here so that, again, for those that are live streaming, they can see them better. So any?
Do you have pamphlets or information on, I can hand out people about the jobs available for census?
So information about job availability in the census. Would one of you like to come up here? Or actually all three of you can come up and, wrestle down the answers.
We don't. It is all online. If you look it up, it's 2020census.gov, and I think it's /jobs. And you could probably just print that out or make it easily yourself. It's pretty simple.
Question over here.
For the You said that there's going to be a question of country of origin. Have you put any thought or planning into like people from New Mexico and Southern Colorado that have been there, are consider themselves Latino and Hispanic and have been there for many generations, like before this was the United States in that area? And so when you ask them what country of origin, they always are kind of at a loss. Do we say Mexico? Do we say Spain? I mean, what do we say? What do you advise us to say?
So, yeah, so the question was around the question on the census regarding Hispanic origin, and what do some people in like Colorado or like New Mexico put when they've, their families have been there centuries. So, so the question will be on Hispanic origin. We will provide education on like why it's important and how we got to specifically that format. What we usually tell folks, and we have to tell folks, is it's however they identify. Now, New Mexico is very particular, however. So New Mexico is one of the states where we have one of the largest some of the largest Latino hard-to-count communities, because most of the folks are Latino, but they've been there many, many centuries, right?
Colorado's the same way.
Right. So one of the things that we will be doing, and I actually just had this conversation with my CEO yesterday around what efforts we would be dedicating specifically to New Mexico, because we work in Texas, but we don't have presence in New Mexico. But New Mexico is just, it's so particular. There's so many challenges. It's very different. It is a Latino community, but it's very different. Now, with the Hispanic origin question, however, we usually just tell folks however they identify, but we will be providing information on why it's important, what are some examples. Another challenge we have is like Afro-Latino communities, right, in like the Northeast. So there's a lot of like nuances that we have to work on, yeah.
Thank you. You had a question?
Yes, my question is for Lizette. I know you guys said you have more of the Spanish people. And so how you can help the other people who's not non-Spanish, who doesn't know about census, that census. Like for example, for me, I've been here for so long. That's the first time I see it's important. They've been bringing me that paper, I put them in the trash. I didn't know I have to fill them out because nobody had told me. And as an educator, it's not everybody who sends their kids to school. Maybe, I don't know if you guys spread it at the hospital, wherever you have kids is growing up. So how, and you said you have it in TV, so how can you implement the same information you give to Latino people, to other people, African American people? Yeah,
so even though our particular focus is the Latino community, so what folks should know is that in addition to like the work that we're doing, there is this national infrastructure that we work under, which is overseen by the Leadership Conference, which has what they call hubs for different communities, right? So I do the Latino hub, Undercover Children hub, we have the Native American hub, Arab American hub, and so we work nationally. We have the National LGBTQ Task Force, so we work nationally across the groups to make sure, so in our communities where there's a lot of interaction overlap is with the African American community, especially in California, and then with the Asian American community, especially again in California. And so we do work very closely with like Baji, who is a organization that works with African immigrants specifically. We work closely with Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And so all of the information we provide is fully bilingual. So we do, everything kind of applies. The only area where we hone in specifically for Latinos is in the Spanish language media work, and it's in the particular like research work. However, for template PSA scripts, for template potential news stories, for general information on operations, for the train the trainer, all of that will apply to all communities. So even though our hub is the Latinx hub, we are happy to work with all of our partners and kind of figure out how it overlaps. But most of the information does, it translates well into all the other communities because it's the same.
What I'm trying to say, how do we know you guys exist? If I have organization, I know you guys exist. how you guys gonna reach out to my organization to let me know, I can let my people know?
This way.
How you do it?
This way. So a lot of the work that we do is one, so we have the national hub organizations, which we kind of collaborate and work together and figure out what resources we have to pull together. And then at the state level, you have kind of these other mechanisms that we work through. So for example, in California, there's a complete count committee at the state level. And then every county has complete count committees. And then sometimes every city has complete count committees. So we interact at the national level, and then at the state infrastructure, county infrastructure, and city infrastructure for all of the key states that we focus on, we also interact. So for example, at the national level, we work with a group called FIRM, that is like all of the immigrant groups, right? But at the local level in LA, that group is CHIRLA because they're an affiliate. And so same thing with Baji. Baji we work with at the national level, and then it depends on their local affiliate or local organizer who we work with. But a lot of what we're trying to do right now, even with the work we're doing here, is reach out to folks so that they know that resources are out there and information is out there, and that we're happy to help with whatever resources or information we have.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is a national hub for Black people, and the organization that manages that is Color of Change or Color of Change? Yeah.
Color of Change.
Over 4.
Okay, so Color of Change specifically for African American.
Yes, and you can find all of these hubs if you go to censuscounts.org.
Hey, Debbie.
We're all connected
Debbie.
to sorry. All of the hubs are connected to censuscounts.org. So if you're looking for information for a particular community, start there, and then you can find links to all of us.
So thank you. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much. And we will make sure that all 3 presentations are on the app. I don't think they are right now, but we'll make sure they're on the app so that you can access them after you leave here. So thank you. Don't forget there's a period product kit making down outside the Grand Ballroom or upstairs. No, down here, right down here. And don't forget your passports through the exhibitor emporium in by 5 o'clock. Thank you.